That's right. Well, I'm 0-2 right now, and I said, it's important we have fun. I mean, that's really what matters in this league is that, that we're having fun. So everybody joining us on Facebook is going to miss all the fantasy football updates, but that's what you're going to do. So, yeah, I wondered how many people were going to be here tonight because it's beautiful outside, and I know a lot of folks are traveling, but you are the dedicated, faithful ones.
Yeah, we're not traveling.
And you're not traveling, right? And as Jesus would say to the disciples, will you leave me also? I was really struggling tonight because I had a few more things I wanted to say in way of introduction, but I wasn't sure that I could fill out 45 minutes of that in the way of introduction. And I didn't want to just start one of the prophets tonight, especially since I was going to be out next week. Shirley Scribner is going to be here next week and talk about her recent trip to Zambia and get a chance to debrief about that. So that's what next Wednesday will be. But I wasn't sure what to do, and I really think though that at the end of the day, where we are is going to be good because this is some important context for the prophets. So kind of we talked last time about sort of what prophets were, sort of their function as individuals, and I wanted to talk a little bit about the text, but also I wanted to give you a little history and geography about the text too, because so much of that comes into play in interpreting what the prophets had to say. The geographic position of Israel, where you are in the historical timeline in the history of Israel, and the political situation of everything going around Israel is really important for understanding what's going on in the prophets. And so tonight is basically a context night for us as we look at this. So first of all, a textual comment. I mentioned this last week. The prophets is one of the three sections of the Hebrew scriptures. You have Torah, or the law, you have the Nevi'im, or the prophets, and you have the Ketubim, or the writings, which I always joke that Ketubim was sort of the Hebrew word for miscellaneous. So if it's not a law and it's not a prophet, we stick it in the writings. And that's where the Psalms are, that's where Song of Songs, Esther, Daniel, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, anything that doesn't fit anyplace else goes in that last section of Hebrew Scripture. But the prophets is a huge third of what the Hebrew Bible actually is. And what surprises some people, and it may have surprised you when I mentioned it last week, is that there are the former prophets and the latter prophets. And the former prophets are not books that you normally think of as prophetic books. Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings are considered prophetic books in Hebrew tradition. They are prophets. And a lot of people wonder why that is. I mean, what is it about these books that is prophetic? And there are stories about the prophets. I mean, this whole section, particularly 1 and 2 Samuel, 1 and 2 Kings, are going to have a lot of stories about prophets in them. But Joshua and Judges, not so much. You don't have as much prophetic speech. So what is it about it that makes them prophetic? Well, these four, they're really originally 4 books, 6 in our English counting, but originally these 4 books. These books are also known as the Deuteronomic History or Deuteronomistic History. And they are called that because there is one theological idea that sort of controls these books, and that is that obedience brings blessing and disobedience brings punishment. And it's called Deuteronomic because that's basically the theology of Deuteronomy. And all throughout the book of Deuteronomy, if you obey, good things will happen. If you disobey, bad things will happen. And Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings tell stories that echo that theology, right? So when people are obedient, good things happen. When people are disobedient, bad things happen. What's significant about that, I think, and the reason we can think of these books as prophetic, is that this section of Scripture, like much of the Old Testament, but this section in particular, was likely composed/edited in exile. So they are sitting in exile after being driven from their land, after the Babylonians have carried them off, and wrestling with some very basic identity questions. Why are we here? What is going on? And so in many ways, I think these books were edited and put together with a sort of prophetic concern to help explain why it is you're there. Disobedience brought punishment, and as a result, now you sit in Babylon. And so the time comes, as we see in Judges, to repent so that God can raise up deliverance and we can go back to the land again. But all the way through there you have that cycle of obedience brings blessing, disobedience brings punishment, that Deuteronomic theology. There are a couple of exceptions, as you know, it doesn't take long to live in this world to learn there are a couple of exceptions to obedience brings blessing and disobedience brings punishment. And there are even a couple of exceptions in here. The two most notable would be Josiah, the most righteous king that Judah ever has, dies mysteriously and unfortunately. And Manasseh, the most wicked king that Judah ever has the longest reign of any of the kings of Judah. So apart from those two small matters of embarrassment, most of the time the obedient are blessed and the disobedient are punished in the tale telling of that story. Life gets in the way of our neat theology sometimes, so what are you going to do? So I think that's why there's a prophetic concern in those texts. It is a concern and call to obedience that you get in their overall editing. So that's probably why they're considered prophets. So how are we doing? Questions, comments, struggles? Did you ever heard those called prophets before? Anyone ever heard the prophets? Yeah. The former prophets and latter prophets is how you'll hear me call them more often. I don't say major and minor as much. I don't like minor prophets just because it just devalues these wonderful books of the 12. I just don't like that. So you'll hear me say the 12. Although on test, very often I got latter prophets with D's. So apparently those prophets were climbing things all the time. Homophones. So, yes, sir.
What are the 12? They're subsumed in their own book.
They are their own.
Right?
They're on their own scroll.
Their own scroll. That's it.
Yes.
Does the scroll have a special name?
The 12.
It's just called the 12.
Yes, it is.
Fantastic.
Yeah, it's a really clever name. It's functional as well because it turns out there's 12 of them, so it works. But yeah, the latter prophets, really what we normally think of as prophets: Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12. And the 12 are organized in the Hebrew text and most English texts, although there are a couple of exceptions. Hosea, then Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. Roughly speaking, chronologically, not exactly. And we're going to look at sort of the chronologies here in just a minute. There are a lot of very interesting readings of the 12 that actually read the 12 canonically. And what I mean by that is, instead of looking at just the message of Hosea, the message of Amos, the message of Nahum, to look at the themes that are across broadly all of these books and how they're addressed as you go through it. And so probably the most prominent individual to read it that way is a guy named Jim Mikowski. Jim is a professor at Baylor and he wasn't there when I was there, but he's there now. He's a great guy. And he's done a lot of work on the 12. In fact, I believe the Smith and Hellis commentary is his on that. He's very, very good. But it's one of those things that just, for me, is fun to take a moment and just step back and remember that, yeah, all of these books have their own individual concerns, but in the putting together of these books, themes and thoughts emerge as well that are kind of fun to explore, and ideas of the day of the Lord and justice and God's place in the cosmos and those sorts of things. So that's fun. So, yes, sir.
Did any of the 12 know each other?
I think there's a very good chance that Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, and Jeremiah were all contemporaneous. I think possibly, in addition to those, Joel and Obadiah might have been hanging out at about the same time. So all of them come from about the same 30-year period, which probably is a good time to go to the next slide. The rough dates, you have the 8th century prophets. These are all the writing prophets. Now, of course, there are prophets before this. We've got Elijah and Elisha and Micaiah ben Imlah and the unnamed Ish Elohim, the men of God that you have. But these are the writing prophets. And I'm going to say rough dates because really, they're really rough dates. The 8th century prophets, Amos, Hosea, Micah, and the first half of Isaiah clearly come from the 8th century. 7th century prophets, and by 7th century, I mean end of the 7th century. In the beginning of the 7th through probably all the way to 630 BC, Manasseh's on the throne and killed most of the prophets. In fact, tradition says that it was under his reign that Isaiah was martyred. Tradition says that Isaiah was placed in a hollow log and then they sawed the log in half, which I still don't understand the purpose of the log if you're doing that. I mean, you're just going to kill the guy. I don't know why you just, I mean, so I had a student say maybe it was a magic trick that went wrong. Maybe, and I give you, I'm going to get so much crap for this. I don't know. But anyway, tradition says he was put to death. Josiah comes on the throne, and it's after Josiah gets on the throne and then his successor, eventual successor, Jehoiakim, that you start to see these prophets emerge here. And it's Nahum preaching around 612, Habakkuk sometime in that window, Zephaniah in that window. Ezekiel starts a little after them. In fact, I should probably put Ezekiel in the 6th century because he probably doesn't start till 592. And then Jeremiah spans from 630 to 582 plus. So he had a really long reign for a prophet, which is really unusual. And then the prophets of the return are Haggai and Zechariah. If anyone ever asks you on your Introduction to the Ancient Near East test, who are the prophets of the rebuilding, and you say Ezra and Nehemiah, you will get it wrong. I'm just speaking for personal experience on that, because I wasn't paying attention that day. And it turns out Ezra and Nehemiah, neither one prophets. So that's one of the reasons they're not the prophets of the rebuilding. And Dr. Browning made really large red X's on my test and said, this was the one day I missed, and apparently it was a rather important day, because Haggai and Zechariah. So I haven't forgotten that. That was 25 years ago. Haggai and Zechariah, prophets of the rebuilding, just so you know. And then the second part of Isaiah, 40 to 66, dates to the 6th century. There is at least 150-year gap between the first half of Isaiah and the second half of Isaiah. In fact, there's no transition between those two. The last verse of chapter 39 is the 8th century and King Hezekiah. And the first verse of chapter 40 is after the exile, it's on the way out, and people are returning from exile at the end 150 years later. No transition between them. Yes?
So we're talking like end of the 6th century.
Here? Yeah, last half. 539, 529, somewhere in that range is where you put this Isaiah.
Yeah, no, that's one.
Yeah, so the last half of the 6th century.
Gotcha.
For that reason, you hear people talk about 1st and 2nd Isaiah a lot. Some of you may have heard of 1st and 2nd Isaiah, or 1st Isaiah and Deutero Isaiah. There's also Trito Isaiah, yes. Some people break 40 to 55 and 56 to 66 up. There seems to be a passage of time between 55 and 56, but it's not as clear as 40 to me, and so that one to me is much more subjective. I mean, it's there, and they're probably right, but it's not as clear. This one's 150 years. I mean, the other one is probably 20, which, in the span of 3,000 years is hard to put a bullseye on. So you will see people talk about this. You will also see commentaries written that are written by two different people. One of them will be 1 to 39, and one will be 40 to 66, just like they're two separate books. That is not uncommon to have the commentaries break it up like that. Probably since 1990 something, you have started to see scholars become more comfortable talking about the book of Isaiah as a whole again. That it is obviously an intentionally edited whole. One of the first scholars did that was a guy named Edgar Conrad in a book called Reading Isaiah, in which he talked about reading the book and analyzing themes in the first half of the book that are important in the second half of the book. And so it's probably true that this material does come from the 8th century, but it was edited together with this material at a later date intentionally to have an important message. And so you're starting to see scholars, one guy write a book on Isaiah now instead of 3. And there are some commentary series that have 3 different authors for 3 different Isaiahs, which you might notice is not in your Bible. We have a 1st and a 2nd Samuel and a 1st and a 2nd Chronicles, but your Bible says Isaiah. And the great Isaiah scroll of the Qumran text, the dates to the 2nd century BC, 66 chapters, one book. And so even that one is a literary unit. So as much as scholars like to try to divide this, most everyone was thinking of it as Isaiah, even really, really early. And so and you don't see Jesus quoting from Isaiah saying, in the first part of Isaiah and the second part of Isaiah, he says Isaiah. And so when we talk about Isaiah, we'll talk more about this, but I think it's worth just kind of bringing you up to speed on that. The last group, nobody knows when to put these. Malachi is comfortably late. Jonah is comfortably late. Now, I should say it was written down before 400 BC, but we don't know. The story itself is set in the 9th century BC. So the story of Jonah is set up here on our timeline, but it's not written down until here because that's when the need arose. Jonah, and the reason you can be so sure about the date of it being written down is because the language that they use reflects a later Hebrew. It's kind of like you can tell the difference between a King James text and a 21st century text. I mean, you can tell that just by the language that's being used. Hebrew's like that as well. It changes over time, and there's some obvious 4th, 5th, post-exilic clues in the Hebrew that indicates it's a later composition. Now, that doesn't mean it wasn't an earlier story that was kept alive orally over a long period of time. It's just that it was that tension of who are we going to be that motivated the writing of it so late. So these are written down late. Joel and Obadiah, I don't know what to do. Probably, I am pretty comfortable putting Obadiah in the 6th century, and I'm probably going to put Joel in a little bit here in the 6th century, probably more than the 5th, but a lot of scholars don't. So I'm willing to say, yeah, before 400 BC is about all I can tell you on those books, what we're dealing with there. So, questions, comments, struggles on that? Good? So, I always wrestle with how to teach the prophets. Historically, in my teaching career, I always taught them historically. I started with the first prophet, started with Amos, who's generally accepted to be the first written prophet, and kind of moved forward from there. Then I fell under the conviction of the Holy Spirit, and as a canonical scholar, I started debating with myself, just how canonical a scholar am I if I'm breaking up Isaiah and I'm teaching these things? I probably should go as the canon does it: Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, and then the Book of the 12. And so I did that probably in the later few years of my teaching career. I'm swinging back around or backsliding, I don't know, because I think I'm going to do it historically on our little journey together. I'm going to start with Amos and sort of move forward from there and use the history of Israel as sort of our anchor for how we're going to look at these prophets in time, because I just think that helps as we think about Israel living through history, just kind of inserting the prophets as we go as kind of bookends in that. So that's I think the approach I'm going to take on that. So, whether you like it or not, that's what I'm going to do. All right, geography is important, and this is something that we don't talk about a lot in church, but it really is a kind of important thing when you're looking at your Old Testament stuff, and that is that for the entire prophetic corpus, not counting the former prophets, for all of the latter prophets, we've got 2 nations that we're dealing with. There are 2 countries, both that claim Yahweh as their God, both that think of themselves as let out of captivity in Egypt, both with their own places of worship, and they are co-strugglers in this journey, and at times with their own international problems. The northern kingdom of Israel had about 9.5 or 10 tribes of the original 12-ish, which we talked about before, 12-ish tribes. And then the kingdom of Judah had Judah, and then it had swallowed up the tribe of Benjamin, and it swallowed up part of the tribe of Simeon's land as well. So 2 to 2.5-ish, plus the Levites, who of course didn't have their own land. So that's sort of 3, but they didn't figure in the 12 because of it's math. I told you, it's old ancient math, and it doesn't make sense. So the 12 tribes are really 13, except it's 14 if you count Joseph, but we don't. We normally break those up. And so about 10, about 2. That's what I'm saying. So, who's got it?
We always get deceived and trick ourselves into believing that it's a postage stamp size country.
It's pretty close to a postage stamp.
Well,
Yeah, for scale.
But if you put the southern tip of today's Israel on Richmond,
Yeah.
the Golan Heights are Harrisburg, Pennsylvania.
Right.
That's still pretty small.
That's not true. Well, in the context of Utah and Colorado, it's small, but I mean, you don't just walk across it.
An Israeli pilot told me if he gets in his afterburners at Eilat in the Red Sea, he has to get out in 1 minute or he's in Lebanese airspace.
Yes, that's, but that
Wow.
yellow line.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes,
Yeah,
60
right.
seconds.
That's well known.
From Jerusalem to Jericho is 15 miles. Okay, so from here to here is 15 miles.
Okay, so that's Spotsylvania, Fairfax, Loudoun County.
Yeah, I mean that's the DC to Sterling. Right?
You can do that in March.
Yeah. And by the way, this is I wasn't going to talk about this, but it's really worth talking about. The elevation at the Mediterranean Sea is sea level. That's how that works, in case you were curious. From Ashdod, well, let's go a little further north. From Tel Aviv, Jaffa, right in here to Jerusalem, 30 to 40 miles. Elevation goes from sea level to 2,200 feet above sea level. The next 15 miles goes from 2,200 feet above to 1,500 feet below sea level. So when Jesus says, a man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho, a man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho.
At the
That's
beginning of John, the priests and Levites sent,
right.
They sent priests and Levites down from Jerusalem.
Down from Jerusalem's on a mountain. Everybody goes down. You always go up to Jerusalem, right? That's how that works. You go up from this direction, you go up from this direction, you go from this direction.
But again, the air travel story and the highway at 65
Sure.
miles an hour travel, you gotta put yourself in the 5th century BC.
Sure.
A 20-mile voyage is 2 or 3 days.
Probably, yeah. Well, especially with an entourage,
Women and
right?
kids and-
With women and kids
Context
and
of the time.
animals and all of that, absolutely. But it's still, in the span of the ancient world, it's nothing.
It's not Rome in the 1st century.
It's not. I mean, there are a lot of kingdoms a lot like Judah, right? You've got Moab, you've got Edom, you've got Ammon, you've got Syria, or here the more proper Aram, Damascus, or Arameans you'll get here. The King James Bible, when it was translated, thought Assyria was closer to Israel than it turned out it actually was. And so this nation of Syria is called Syria because of that translation. Most of the modern translations call it Aram or Aram Damascus. All of these kingdoms about the same size as Judah. I mean, relatively same GNP, relatively the same size army, not in any way massive or concerning. Israel had a couple of advantages. They were on the Via Maris this way. They were on the major trade routes. And so a little richer, a little more diverse, but military experts will tell you, a little more exposed. Is what that also means, because it turns out armies can use the same roads that traders can use. Most people don't. You got to be aware of that. And so, as a result, first to go, 722, and so from 922 to 587, but I should say from 722 to 587, just the kingdom of Judah. And during that time, under Manasseh, it expanded back a little more. So Judah actually sort of swallowed up some of these old states a little bit. Beersheba is the ancient border of Israel. Dan to Beersheba, Dan is here. To Beersheba was ancient Israel, which is about half the size of the modern state of Israel. And if you're driving from Bet-Shan through the valley to Jericho and Qumran, you can make that trip in about 3 hours in a car, going about 55, 60 miles an hour. So it's not long. And that's getting through some checkpoints, so it's not much. What's significant about our prophets is most of our prophets are preaching down here. Everybody's down here. Amos and Hosea are the only prophets to the northern kingdom, and Amos is from the south. So Amos is a southerner who went north to tell the northerners what their problems was. As a result, one of my wife's favorite prophets. Go ahead, Tyler.
Within all of received Hebrew canon, are there any books or are there any texts that we think could have possibly originated in the north?
Hosea.
And that's everything
Hosea,
else
I can say
possible.
confidently originated in the north. Now,
Perfect.
as a result, by the way, Hosea is, people will argue, one of the harder Hebrew books to translate. And I think it's because it's the Hebrew dialect from the north. I mean, he's using the Hebrew a little differently. There are speculations as to what might have a northern origin. And I think probably makes some good sense for the Elohistic Psalter, which we talked about this summer. So Psalms 42 to 84, at least Psalms 42 to 72, I think probably had a northern origin. I think it's very possible that in the north they prefer the term Elohim over the south where they prefer the term Yahweh. That, by the way, for those of you paying attention in church on Sunday, is why I think we have Psalm 14 and Psalm 53. I think they probably got duplicated because they probably are representing two different hymn books. In 722, huge numbers of refugees from the north fled south. And we see a ton of new construction around Jerusalem as a result of that.
I wrote down on Sunday because you said God really wanted to emphasize it.
Got to have it twice. Same reason. Well, God wanted to have it twice, and so God didn't have to put it in there twice. He could have marked that one out. But it's in there twice, and I think historically the reason is because of this. I think theologically the reason is God wants us to have it twice. So I think both those things are true. So this is going to be important. Keep this in mind. Keep this scale in mind, because we're about to, in a few minutes, we're going to broaden this context out to the broader ancient Near East, and that's going to be important for this conversation. So,
what refugees would have survived?
well, you can't, even as bad as the Assyrians were, you can't kill everybody. And so the Am Haaretz, that's what they're often called, the people of the land, the poorest of the poor, who lived outside the cities in those areas but didn't want to accept. I mean, Damascus in 733, Damascus was destroyed by Sennacherib, the king of Assyria. And it wasn't just destroyed, it was obliterated, so much so they couldn't even install a puppet government. It became an Assyrian protectorate in 733. And so, eventually people just start, things start getting bad, people start moving. And in 722, the end of the 8th century, 701, when we talk about Hezekiah and we'll talk about his preparations for the invasion of Sennacherib, part of the reason he's having to make those preparations is the fallout from the destruction here, and the reason we've got a ton of new population that needs protecting around Jerusalem. He built a second wall to protect them as a result of that. And so yeah, just whoever makes it, and the Assyrians were, they were pretty thorough, but they were bad. They were bad guys.
Did they see that as having their strategic interests, or were they just doing it to acquire more?
The Assyrians?
Yes.
Oh, it was absolutely strategic. In fact, the way that what they often did, what they always did, when they conquered a new area, they took as many people captive as they could, the best of the best, the cream of the crop, top of society, and they resettled them. And they didn't settle them all in one place. They spread them throughout the empire into other areas they conquered. And then they took those other people that they conquered and they spread them back in other places as well. And their idea was, if people can't live together in the same place, they can't organize resistance against us. And so it was 100% strategic when they did these things. And that's why when you get the return from exile in Ezra and Nehemiah, the people who are left in the land see themselves as descendants of the conquered tribe, of the fallen tribes of Israel. Judah sees them as descendants of the conquerors, and as a result, we get the Samaritans, which come from them. Tradition believes the Samaritans are there because they are the result of the inbreeding of the remains of the destruction of the northern kingdom and the people the Assyrian brought in at the same time, so they're half-breeds. They saw themselves as followers of Yahweh, so they had their own temple on Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal. When the Samaritan woman says, the Jews say, you worship in Jerusalem, but we worship on that mountain, she's pointing to Mount Gerizim, where the Samaritan temple was before the Jews destroyed it in the 2nd century, or 1st century, I guess it was. John Hyrcanus destroyed it. BC, 1st century BC. 1st or 2nd, I can't remember John Hyrcanus' dates, so don't quote me on that one.
He's 1st century BC.
Yeah, I thought he was.
Can't confirm.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Bethel, by the way, was the edge of the northern kingdom's borders. Dan and Bethel, where they had shrines erected to Yahweh. They used golden calves to represent him. I'm just going to take a moment to say, if at any point in any plans of worshiping God, someone suggests, you know what we need? Golden calf. It's a bad idea. I'm just going to go ahead and say that universally, that's a bad idea. And Jeroboam says, you know what would be great for this Yahweh worship? Golden calf. In fact, let's make 2. And so one at Dan, one at Bethel, that mark the territory. This is significant because Amos is standing in the sanctuary at Bethel when he gives his sermon. He's at the royal sanctuary telling the king what his problems are, right by that golden calf. So that's going to be an important part of this. So he's from Judah, but he's just popping in to cross the Mason-Dixon line there to give his sermons in that. So any other geographical, historical questions? All right. One more thing, political context. There are 3 major Iron Age empires that we need to care about. The Iron Age in Israel Well, the Iron Age, Iron 1 is 1200 to 1000. That's not important. Iron 2 and Iron 3 are 1000 to 539 in Israel. And in that time period, we have three major empires: the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and the Persians. In the Old Testament, well, let me say this. Historically, you really can't tell the difference in the tactics of any three of these. The Assyrians showed folks how to do it. The Babylonians and Persians learned well, and they fought exactly the same way that the Assyrians and the Babylonians did. However, in the Old Testament, two bad guys, one good guy. Okay, so the rest of the world, the ancient Near East, probably couldn't tell you the difference between them in the way in which they behaved and their policies and such. But in the Old Testament, the Persians are the good guys, because the Persians, well, I told you all three had different practices. The Assyrians spread everybody out so that nobody can live together and nobody can rebel. The Babylonians said, you know, if people live together, they might be happier and they wouldn't rebel. And so when Judah is taken into exile, they're allowed to live together. And as a result, they're able to hold on to their ethnic identity and able to return from exile with their holy books and practices, and were able to keep having this conversation. If they hadn't done that, they would have been lost just like the northern tribes were lost in the Assyrian conquest. However, Cyrus the Great comes along and says, you know, if we let people go home, they'd really be happy. And so they send all the conquered peoples back home and provide state funds to rebuild their temples and rebuild their cities. And so as a result, Cyrus is regarded as the hero. In fact, he's called Messiah in the book of Isaiah, Messiah, anointed by God, and letting them go. So the Persians are always the good guys. So do you have a?
No.
No, okay. Now, these are the three major players, as I said. Egypt is always who they're worried about, okay? And all throughout the ancient times, Egypt is always trying to get into the story. You know, everybody wants to control Palestine, because if you control that tiny little strip of land, you control the only land bridge from Asia to Africa. And that's important from a military perspective, that's important from an economic perspective. So up until 1000, Egypt had control pretty much undisputed in that area. They really had most of the control there. They had some of those Canaanite cities as protectorates and received some tribute from them, and every now and then would try to protect them, but Egypt was in control. The end of the 10th century, 900, Shishak came through as a pharaoh and asserted power at the end of the 10th century, but then Assyria started coming on the rise. Egypt started to fade, and in the 8th century in particular, Assyria, you couldn't stop them. I think they're one of the first to weaponize terror in the way in which they fought. The story would go something like this. We'll start with Tiglath-Pileser III. Tiglath-Pileser III is he's one of the baddest generals in the history of warfare, as far as I'm concerned. He would lead his empire up to your local city, and he would knock on the door, and he'd say, "Hi, I represent the Assyrian Empire, a growing opportunity for you would want to be a part of. Would you like to join this amazing enterprise?" And if you said, "Wow, that sounds like a great deal, how do I sign up?" They would say, "Well, just pay your taxes." And they would say, "Oh, I'd be happy to." Then everything's fine. Nobody dies if that happens, okay? But if he knocks on the door and says, "Hi, we represent the Assyrian Empire," and you say, "Well, let me get my checkbook," and then you lock the door, now you got to be made an example of. They would besiege the city, and they always won. They always won. There was never a siege that ever turned out okay. They would, when they finally breached the walls, and they always did, they had sophisticated siege machines. They had these wheeled kind of wagons that they had these tarps over that they kept moistened, so that when you launched flaming arrows from the gate, it wouldn't do anything because the tarps were actually moistened, and you were able to ram the gates as you did that. Meanwhile, there's guys on the walls with these huge chains that are trying to pull up on the battering rams as they get close to the wall. And you get these sophisticated battles, but eventually the Assyrians won. They always win. They behead the lucky ones. They flay the unlucky ones. They will simply peel the skin off of them. They would stick them on poles outside the city, and they would stick them on poles in such a way that they would not puncture vital organs, so you bleed out over hours instead of dying instantly, so you could be tormented. They would lead people off naked with fishhooks through their lips, men and women. They would shave half of the men's beards off, the ones they would allow to survive, to shame them as they go. And they took pictures of this. They would carve these elaborate bas-reliefs of this warfare, which is why I know it in such detail. I've seen the pictures. And there are people on stakes, and there are people going to the city, and the armies are being marched off. And they would line the walls of the palace with these depictions of what happened to cities who were disobedient. And then the next year, they only pick up the taxes the first year for free. The next year, you have to bring them to the capital. And when you do, you get to walk along the halls and see what happened to everyone who didn't pay their taxes as they go through. So it's using terror as a weapon. And they were relentless and always successful. And the Babylonians and the Persians learned warfare from them very well and did exactly the same sorts of things. Masters of siege warfare all the way through that. And as I say, Egypt is always the one they're fighting. From the end of the 8th century to the end of the 7th century, Assyria controlled Palestine. And probably the only thing that caused their downfall was they went too far. They actually conquered Egypt. By the way, Egypt, best home field advantage in the ancient Near East. I think in 1,000 years they were conquered twice, once by the Assyrians and once by the Babylonians, that ever actually conquered over into that area. But Assyria expanded too much, Egypt comes back, Babylon comes in and swoops in the vacuum there, and then Babylon expands in that all the way down through till 539 when they had expanded too far, and then the Persians come in for the rest of our time in the Old Testament before the Greeks show up there at the end of the 4th century. So this is the international scene. This is the international political situation. And everybody wants this. This is what it is. So Egypt is trying to control this as a buffer against the Assyrians. The Assyrians are trying to control it as a buffer against Egypt. Egypt's against the Babylonians. Egypt's against the Persians. This is the Babylonian region here. Assyria is up here. Persia is over here. Okay, so Persia, Assyria, Babylon, and Egypt. This is all desert. So everybody's wanting this fertile part of this crescent here that's very fertile. You might even call it a fertile crescent that you have. Is where everybody's trying to move through. The Hittites had been a big deal back in the 2nd millennium, but they were gone at this point. Yeah.
Speaking of the 2nd millennium,
yeah.
The other important point that needs to be made here is all 3 of those civilizations date back to like the earliest records.
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
And I was actually reading a little bit about this today, but Assyria, what we're seeing, the dates that we're seeing here, the Neo-Assyrian Empire,
correct,
is technically what they're called.
Right.
As you know.
I didn't want to cause that people
without going into the short of it is like all of these kingdoms have been going into the Levant and trying to annex control over those and also Tyre and Sidon to the north for like 2,000 years.
They had
by the time we get to the Old Testament.
Correct. Yeah, because again, only land bridge between Asia and Africa. That's it. It's that important. The capital was Ashur for a while. Nineveh also for a little while. Ur of the Chaldees is where Abraham was from. But this, obviously, that gives you some scale. Major international superpower, bunch of little bitty nations that you get down here. Okay, and armies to match at that point. And that's going to be extremely important when we look at the book of Isaiah. Because the beginning of the book of Isaiah is all set within this massive international political conflict. And you just can't understand what's going on without understanding the battle of the governments that's going on. The Assyrians, the Egyptians, the northern kingdom of Israel, Syria, Aram, Judah, all trying to live in a world where these guys are going at it. That's the setting of the book of Isaiah, and I think really, really important as we think about it. So, other thoughts, clarifications? It's a lot of history, I know, but I think it's helpful. Good? Okay. Couple of random musings that I wanted to make sure we understood when we think about the canon again. Like most Old Testament books, prophetic books come together over time. They are shaped over time. I've already alluded to that we talked about Isaiah 1 to 39 and 40 to 66 having such vastly different origins, but coming together over time. And I just think that's important that community shape that. And again, I don't think that compromises inspiration because I believe God is at work in that shaping. I mean, this text is inspired because I believe God inspires it. And however God chooses to compose the text is inspired. And so it causes some people heartburn like that if a guy named Isaiah doesn't write Isaiah. But ultimately, since I believe God is the author, I don't get too much heartburn about that. However God chooses to bring the text together is fine. And even though we do call these writing prophets, it's very likely they weren't the ones that put pen to paper. It's much more likely that these stories were kept alive orally, which is probably why they are in beautiful and complex poetry, because that aids in memorization. So all of our prophets, with the exception of Malachi, are poetry. Now there are some prose sections of some books. Isaiah 36 to 39 are lifted out of Kings. I mean, just lifted these 3 chapters out of the book of Kings and drops them right in the middle of this prophetic book. But we'll talk about why and when we get there. But so that's obviously a large prose section, but most of the book is complex, beautiful poetry all the way through. Some of them love their puns. Micah loves puns. I mean, he just can't get enough puns. And of course, we miss those in our translations, but that's okay because most Americans don't like puns anyway. So it'd probably just be better not to highlight those because people just groan when you make puns these days. But Micah was crazy about puns, and they all have their own sort of artistic flair in the way they do things. And I try to highlight those when I can. And again, I don't want to skip that these again are the minority voice. Most of the prophets in 588 were saying that destruction would never come to Israel. Most of the prophets were saying that everything's going to be fine, God's going to be with us, God will never let anything happen to God's king, God will never let anything happen to God's city, God will never let anything happen to God's temple. And then all of a sudden the exile comes. And it's really embarrassing when you're a prophet. And so these all represent voices that were marginalized when they spoke. Yes, sir?
So you mentioned that last time, and I actually was thinking about this over the week. Do we have any evidence, like either intertextually in this or outside, that indicates that?
Yes. I mean, there's a couple ways to answer that. You've got the example of something like the end of 1 Kings, when Ahab wants to go to war against Ramoth Gilead, and all of the prophets of Baal all the prophets are agreeing with Ahab, and Jehoshaphat says, "Do you not have a prophet of the Lord?" And turns out that the prophet of the Lord said, "You're going to die." And so he's the one guy that was representing the opposite of that. So even within the text, there are narratives. Well, Elijah on Mount Carmel, right? I alone am left among the prophets of God, and you have 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah. So, I mean, even there, you have that testimony. But in some place like Jeremiah, where you have Jeremiah 28, where Hananiah breaks the yoke off of Jeremiah's back and says, no, God's going to break the yoke of Babylon. And Jeremiah says, boy, that is good news, and leaves. And then God says, I didn't tell him that. Get back in there. Jeremiah comes back and says, oh, never mind. Turns out that's going to be a problem. And so I think there's no question that was prophets were in disrepute in the exile because they had lied all those years. And it's these few minority voices that were saying, actually, we were trying to tell you this all along, that they're the ones that get preserved. But the others don't. So I don't have a lot of textual evidence for that because they didn't preserve those, because they found them not to be a worthwhile testimony.
We see threads of that.
We do. We see those echoes, and we see those images of that. Yeah. And I just think it's important to remember, because these guys are all standing up against popular opinion. They're standing up against popular opinion. They're standing up against the government. They're standing up against their kings, often in the presence of the king. I don't know how Isaiah gets away with doing what Isaiah does. There's some indication Isaiah may have been a member of the royal family, which is the only way that makes sense to me, that he can get away talking to the king the way he does. Is that he does? Amos doesn't get away with talking to the king the way he does. We'll see Amos. Amos did not suffer fools and probably got killed for it. So he's really a hoot. But it's just this bold voice, which brings me to this next part, and I'm probably going to trigger poor Beth. I'm sorry, Beth. I'm just going to go ahead and do it. I'm just going to do it anyway. One of the books that I love and changed my life is Prophetic Imagination, which is a book that Sean Class has been doing on my recommendation, and apparently it hasn't gone well, and I apologize for that. But
we're not smart enough.
What's that?
We're not smart enough.
Well, it is to me, incredibly powerful book, and when we talk about the nature of prophets. And I've got a copy here. You can see it looks like this. Walter Brueggemann. Brueggemann he's a thesaurus. He always uses exactly the word that he means to use, whether you know it or not.
Or he makes one up.
Or he makes one up. Walter can do that. But he is to me just incredibly insightful regarding this particular topic, particularly prophets and speaking about sort of the way they function in Israel. And the book's been in print now for a number of years and really sort of changed my vision of sort of how this goes. And what Brueggemann does is he sort of talks about these two different communities. He's got the royal consciousness, which of course obviously reflects the attitudes of the king and the governing group, versus what he calls the alternative community of Moses. And really what he sees at work in sort of broadly speaking in the time of the prophets, is you have these kings who are desperate to prove that history's just been waiting on them. That they are at the pinnacle of history. We have now finally realized our eschatology. We're sitting in the land, and he sets up as the main foil of that Solomon, and the way in which Solomon governed as an example of this royal consciousness. And so to do that, you need to emphasize the politics of affluence and show that you have, look how God is blessing. So that's an important part of it. A lot of building projects, a lot of forced labor happens during Solomon's time because, again, we have to celebrate look at how God has blessed. And I think Brueggemann is not far off. His reading of the temple is one that was new for me, but one that really provokes some thinking. When the temple is built by Solomon, the goal was to do some quality control. We had all these local shrines all throughout Israel. You had the tabernacle, but up to that point, those local shrines had been a place that was legitimate worship. Solomon was actually at a high place when he gets his vision and he asks for wisdom. So, they were legitimate places of worship. Then Solomon builds the temple, and now the only legitimate place to worship is Jerusalem, according to Solomon. This is the only place where God worship will be accepted, where Yahweh worship is accepted. And on the one hand, I get it. Yes, those local sites had become sites of syncretism and sites of Baal worship, and there was a quality control issue. But I don't think we can overlook, Brueggemann makes a good point, it was also a control issue. That temple that was dedicated to God was part of the royal complex. And now you've got to get through who the king says to get to Yahweh. He's now an intermediary. He's kind of got Yahweh working for him now as the king. And so all of this to add some measure of control, which Brueggemann calls the alternative community of Moses, where God was free to move when God wanted to move. God would raise up leaders in judges when God felt a leader needed to be raised in judges. God was portable. The whole purpose of the tabernacle was to move around. And so I think when you read God's response when David wants to build the temple, you can hear a little of God saying, why do I need a temple? Did I need a temple when I was wandering around? I liked being flexible. I like moving around. I'm a God on the go, gotta be flexible. And so you do hear a little bit of that in that this combating this alternative community. So you've got a prophet who is speaking against a king who wants to have it all together and wants to perceive that it's all together and wants to perceive that he's the one who's sitting there and is the reason it is all together, that Yahweh supports him, Yahweh works for him, Yahweh is his message. And the prophet comes along and say, you know what, God's a lot bigger than that. In fact, God is the God of Nebuchadnezzar. He's using Nebuchadnezzar. We talked about that last time. God is a God who will work in ways that will surprise you. And so the prophet is both criticizing the royal consciousness and the way in which it's being ruled, and energizing the people who are being crushed by it, the people under the boot of the king at that point. So it is a balance. The prophet's message is one balancing criticizing and energizing. True lament in that really is suffering, and providing hope at the same time. So it's not just a message of criticism, but also one of energizing, one of judgment and hope. The prophets do both of those things. Judgment against the status quo, and then energizing for the ones at the bottom. Yeah, go ahead.
Way too big a thought, but it's like the prophets are Martin Luther's and Oliver Cromwell's who fail.
Yeah.
These are Protestant reformations that don't take off.
Right. Right. Yes, the institution itself is, it's so funny because one of the things he talks about, I don't know if it was in the book or I've done this book so often now, I can't remember if it came in conversations with the class or if it's in the book because it's been a while since I looked at it. But just the way we talk about death, and Cindy could speak to this probably better than I can, the way hospitals will make it look as though no one ever dies there. They just look like fancy hotels. When you were at Children's Healthcare Atlanta, kids don't die at Children's Healthcare Atlanta. Never. Isn't that remarkable? Just never talk about that. Because death is a reminder that we're not in control of this. Death is a reminder there are some things we don't control, and so we don't talk about it. We push it aside, and so the prophets are engaging that in a very real way, engaging death in a very real way. We're going to see that in Jeremiah. We're going to see that in Amos. We're going to see that in a lot of the prophets as they truly engage, this death that is truly coming of this royal consciousness, but in light of what God is going to do in some very beautiful and powerful ways, if we are actually committed to God in that way. So I mean, it's really a powerful book, and I'm sorry it hasn't gone as well as it had in the Shalom class, because like I said, for me, it really did open a lot of interesting possibilities about what prophets are and what prophets do at the end of the day. Prophets fall silent in 400 traditionally, even though probably Jonah might be written a little after that. It's possible Joel was written after that. Certainly Malachi, I think, is written after that. But the prophets traditionally fall silent in 400. And I think that's because most of the time, prophetic speech is coming when the people are the dominant party and they're oppressing the poor. Once the people are themselves oppressed, you don't need prophetic speech anymore. Now what you need is apocalyptic speech to give hope in the midst of crisis. And so we see a shift through the exile away from prophetic speech and to apocalyptic speech, because it's apocalyptic speech that brings hope in the time of suffering. And so it's because things flip upside down. You no longer have a ruler class. Now, when Jesus is speaking prophetically, he's speaking prophetically to the Jewish leaders there in Jerusalem. So it's, again, you have leadership there. But then, of course, once the temple is destroyed, we see, prophets, then we believe the prophethood of all believers at that point when that happens for Christians. So that's why the prophets fall silent. In fact, there's general consensus the prophet fell silent in the book of Maccabees, which some of you who may have grown up Catholic might recognize. Book of Maccabees, a history book that comes from the in-between the Testament period. And when they finally retake the temple and cleanse it from the Greek, one of the Greek kings sacrificed a pig to Zeus on the altar in the temple. And I don't know how you make the temple much more profane than that. That's about, I think, as bad as it can get. And they were standing around debating just exactly how much Febreze you needed to fix an altar that had a pig sacrificed to Zeus on it. And they said, you know what? Let's just build a new one. I think it's just better. But they didn't want to throw out the old altar. And so the book of Maccabees says, so they stored the stones on the Temple Mount until a prophet could be found to tell them what to do. So there was an acknowledgement that by the 2nd century, just don't got prophets. No, they're just not around. So Jesus is really invoking that imagery of prophet in that 1st century in some very powerful ways. He stands in good tradition of these prophets, speaking for a dynamic alternative community, a God who's come out of the temple, who is touching the lepers, who's raising the dead, who's not known by isolation but by reaching out. So Jesus is invoking the same prophetic imagination that Brueggemann talks about in the Old Testament. Mm-hmm.
I want to be really careful how I say this.
Okay.
Whenever you invoke the Dead Sea Scrolls, everything is couched in speculation, but
yes.
You also have a very powerful strain of prophetic speaking coming out of that community.
Yes.
That's possibly at odds with the Pharisaic or Sadduceic.
Correct. Yes. In fact, the messianic expectation at Qumran, or the Dead Sea Scrolls, seems to be two messiahs, a kingly one and a priestly one. Yes. A kingly one in the line of David and a priestly one in the line of Aaron. So there was an expectation of sort of two messiahs there. Yeah, you can't say the Jews thought in the 1st century. That is way too,
yeah.
That's like saying Baptists believe. You just can't. There's too many Baptists. You get 2 Baptists, you got 3 opinions, right? So it's hard to get how that all goes. So absolutely, yeah. The prophetic speech, maybe. They wanted a prophet. They wanted to believe they were the sons of light against the children of darkness.
I should revise what I say. A new kind of prophetic genre
yes.
popped up that
yes.
has its climax in the book of John.
And I would say that Revelation is, and I steal this from Richard Bauckham, who's a brilliant Revelation scholar, says Revelation's genre is tricky. It's actually 3 kinds of genre woven together into a new. It is prophetic speech, it is apocalyptic, and it is epistolary. In other words, it's letters that are speaking prophetically in the form of apocalypse. And they're all woven together in a genre that we are not conversant in any 3 of them. Any of the 3, he's combined the 3 to do something really different in the book of Revelation, which is why we misread Revelation so much. But that's for another time, another study. Maybe next fall we'll do Revelation. That'd be fun. So, yes, ma'am.
How have biblical scholars evaluated the work or prophecies of these prophets that you have alluded to? Are certain ones considered very good in certain things?
No, I think they all approach them as speaking in their time in powerful ways, which is why they've been preserved. So, I mean, that's.
They are not evaluated according to
No, I don't think,
impact.
no. I mean, every now and then, we'll talk about whether Jonah was a false prophet or not. That'll be a fun conversation. It's, yeah, they're all speaking in powerful ways, which is why we save them. Yeah, that's why we have them. So. Well, that's our time, so I will let you get to choir practice, and I will get to an outreach meeting. But I will be out next week again. Shirley Scrivener's going to come and talk about her Zambia trip next week, and you can do question and answer and stump the missionary. And then the week after that, we'll come back, and I will we'll start looking at these prophets and some of the amazing and powerful speech that they have, and see how far we get. I think we'll run all the way to May with these prophets, so it should be a fun journey together. All right. Well, have a great night. Have a great week. See you Sunday, if not before. When I loan books, they disappear. I've lost so many of these books. But you may find one.
I can start.
Yeah.
Oh, we signed up? How many have signed up? When I signed up, they do. So else I did like 18 seats when I signed up.
Triple Texas Terror.